So if you recall when we talked about monos, there were a bunch of different kinds of operators. We had factory method operators, we had transforming operators, we had these things called action operators. And what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about action operators. And fluxes also have all these operators too. If you recall with mono, an action operator was an operator that didn't modify the mono, but only had a side effect. And that's the same thing we're going to have for a flux. So we're going to take a look at something called doOnNext. If you recall, monos had a doOnSuccess because it was only one value. With fluxes, you have a stream of these guys, and so therefore we're going to have doOnNext. So if things go well, doOnNext will be called. So doOnNext is going to add a behavior that'll be triggered when a flux emits an item. And remember, a flux could emit multiple items, so this could be called multiple times. What's passed to it is a behavior that's a consumer parameter that's called if things go according to plan. If everything goes well and we get an actual value we want to emit, doOnNext will go ahead and call the consumer. So basically what we're doing here is we're registering a callback to be called back on each element in the flux stream. And hopefully you're familiar with callbacks because we've talked about those before. doOnNext returns a flux that is not modified at all. The type isn't changed, the value isn't changed, nothing has changed. It's just going to have a side effect, which will be to call this consumer onNext hook method on every element that's emitted. This method is primarily used for debugging, logging, or getting visibility into a flux chain. So here's a very simple example. We're going to make ourselves a flux from a big fraction list, and then for each element in the flux, we're going to go ahead and call doOnNext to log that value. So we'll just log it somewhere. We'll write it somewhere. We'll see how this works when we take a look at the case study here shortly. If something goes wrong, then this operation is skipped altogether. RxJava observable has a doOnNext that works exactly the same way. Both of these operators in Project Reactor and RxJava are very similar to the peek operation that's defined in Java streams. So here's that example we looked at before with a little peek added to it. So we make a list of lowercase strings. We turn that into a stream of lowercase strings. We use peek to print out each of the strings in their lowercase form. Then we map them all to uppercase, collect them into a list, and return that list. So peek is, again, a method that an operation that has no behavioral effect other than to have a side effect. It doesn't modify what goes through it. That's the end of the action operators we're going to talk about in the Flux class for the moment. There are actually a bunch more we'll talk about later, things like